Okay, good morning once again. Thanks for making it to this fourth lecture on the development of our majestic mind. We have to do it with one screen, so I hope that will be okay. In the previous lectures we heard about amoeba, about ticks, about fish, about birds, about cats, and about monkeys. But today we are delving more into the human brain, so it will be a level up. We talked about the brainstem, the middle brain, and now we're going to the cortex, so the human part of the brain. So we all know that the frontal part of the brain, of the cortex, is called the frontal lobe. So for many years it was thought that brain research would develop a point-to-point analysis of our psychic functions. So it was thought for a long time, for decades, that each and every part of the brain would belong to a certain feeling. The thought was justified by the various cerebral lobes, which all seem to be involved in a specialized area. So for decades, brain research has focused on identifying particular centers in the cortex of the cerebrum, responsible for certain functions. And this picture I showed you yesterday as well, and you can see there's quite an array of specialized functions. For instance, the posterior part of the brain, you've got a cortical cortex there. So if you get a damage to this part of the brain, you become cortical blind. Then you have a certain area here, auditory association area, or the Broca area where you speak, the area, the somatic sensory association area, frontal. The frontal lobe is the sort of like association area. The frontal part of the brain is not having a specific function. It's not related to a specific task as the other parts, like the vision, auditory, motor, sensation. Most of the research was carried out on patients who had a focal injury to the brain, because that it's very difficult to take a volunteer and remove a part of the brain. But of course, people who are injured at a specific part, you can see what function is deficient, and then you know that it's correlated to that anatomical area. So recently it has been gradually recognized that those focal lesions are not isolated and are nearly always part of a greater defect in the brain. So it is not like you damage a certain area and then only a specific function goes. That actually never happens. It's always more damage than what you initially thought. So a patient who is after an injury unable to identify a body, he will also be unable to recognize a face. It's the same part. So there have been numerous reports written and published on a huge number of mental deficits, each of which was attributed to a specific malfunctioning part of the cortex. But most of them, of these reports, they were not accurate. So the most famous case, you may have heard of him, Phineas Cage. He was working in a factory, and this is a three-dimensional CT scan. So he survived an accident in which a large iron rod was driven completely through his head, and it went through his frontal lobe. It destroyed most of the left frontal lobe, and it changed his personality and behavior for the remaining 12 years of his life. A whole range of difficult to describe characteristics such as tact, self-criticism, moral feeling, altruism, and compassion were changed. It's very important to realize that, and I'm telling my medical students that all the time, your frontal lobe, where you make long-term planning and very careful decisions, it only anatomically matures at the age of 25. So I always tell them, don't get married before you're 25. Because you may get a nasty surprise if you marry at the age of 15 and then when you wake up at 25. And of course, it's got lots of replications. Also, if you look at, I work in the field of child abuse. Now, contrary to what most people think, children are abused by pedophiles in most countries. Pedophile means pedos, feline, love of children. So most people think about a pedophile of a dirty old man who is maybe seducing the child and doing. When I started working in children's hospital, I analyzed the average age of the in our patient population of really thousands of children who have been abused and sexually abused, and the average age of the perpetrator is always 20 years. Yeah, so if you can have many different graphs. This has been studied in many countries. So if you look at any country, the people who commit murder, the people who commit rape, of course it's across all the ages, but the peak is always at 20. Now if you think about it, it's the frontal lobe hasn't matured yet. So there's these youngsters, they've got these big bodies, they've got big balls, and the control center, the frontal lobe is not mature yet. So of course these guys are going to commit more mistakes than the other population. And it's actually unfair, I think, to a certain extent, to put youngsters who've done something wrong, give them exactly the same punishment as elderly people who should know better. Of course, humans are part of the ape family, and here, I mentioned it before in the previous lectures, we are the closest to the chimp, and then to the gorilla, and then to the orangutan, and then to the gibbon. If you look at the frontal lobes, the size of the frontal lobes, you can see that the squirrel monkey's got a tiny frontal lobe, then it's increasing slowly by the cat, and then if you look at the dog, it's even bigger. And then it grows in the chimp, and then of course in men it is the biggest. So where other parts of the brain are strongly wired with and influenced by biological information, the frontal lobe seems to be rather free from being occupied with the direct control of the body. And therefore it may represent the first sort of objective brain part. All other brain parts are strictly under the influence of either vegetative or pre-programmed instincts. And the development of the frontal lobe may represent a first major fault line in between the internal brain programs, which we discussed in the last few lectures, and the external world. So since it has not a clearly defined function, it may be the first organ of relative freedom. So this is a picture of Patricia Churchland, and she believes that the frontal lobe developed to deal with the social landscape in which we are moving. And what has been interesting from research is that the size of the frontal lobe, so the part which takes part of the whole cortex, has relation with the size of community with which we have to cope. What I also find interesting is that if you remove the whole frontal lobe, you don't see any obvious chains on the outside of the person. When people are asked to close their eyes and point, where is the perception of, where the perception originates from the side and the front of their heads, they generally choose a point between the middle of the eyes and 1/3 down. I talked about it in my first lecture. And actually you can see that reflected in art. You see, if you're thinking it, you're not thinking with your spinal cord, although that is very determining in what you're thinking, but it feels like it's more in the front. So this place is remarkably close to what Descartes thought was the center of the Cartesian theater, the pineal gland. When people want to demonstrate how irrational mankind is, they often point to examples such as warfare, cruelty, political pettiness, and religious fanatism. From our forebears, we have inherited a whole range of behavioral patterns. We saw that yesterday in various animals. Evolution has many tricks, but it cannot easily start all over again. And even today, our brainstem is responsible for the vegetative functions such as blood circulation, respiration rate, hormonal regulation, temperature of the body, and so forth. So it is the brainstem which influences the middle brain, and then the middle brain, in turn, influences the cortical, the cortex of the cerebrum. So just another picture of the brainstem, the midbrain, and then it goes to the outside. So now I want to talk about a bit about Eugene Marais and the soul of the ape. So the soul of the ape is basically a double misnomer because he talks about the mind rather than the soul. And he talks about baboon, and as most of you all know, baboons are not apes, they are monkeys, they've got a tail. There's only 5 apes, which I just showed, and the rest are monkeys. Although it's quite a big animal, it is a monkey. So Eugene Marais, I watched, there's a beautiful movie, you can see it free on the internet, it's called The Wonderwerker. It's a few years old, but it's a beautiful movie about his life. He was a South African naturalist from 1871 to 1936. And he is very famous for his book, The Soul of the White Ant. And basically, in this book, he describes the colony of termites as one living being, with every termite being, for instance, the same as a white or a red blood cell. So he assesses it as one organism rather than separate animals. Now what is interesting is that there was some Belgian guy, and he translated it into French, and he plagiarized the work. And apparently this affected Eugene Marais' mental state quite a bit, because he discovered that this guy became very famous, a Nobel Prize winner, and it was on basically complete copy and paste of Eugene Marais' work. So he became a substance abuser, and he used morphine, and you can see that in the movie, and eventually he committed suicide with a shotgun on a farm. What he is less known for is that book, The Soul of the Ape. So he realized that baboons that live in the Cape region and those that live in the Northern Cape are exactly the same species. But these baboons are dependent on the group in which they live in order to learn how to gather food. So this is just a picture of one of them. You probably have seen them on Cape Point. So a baboon transported from the Western Cape and the culture of its own group will not be able to survive in the Northern Cape among the same species where the environment is drier and far more harsh, and therefore the nutritional sources are scarcer, and they have to resolve to other types of food. So if you put a baboon which has been raised in the Western Cape, in Cape Town, put them in the Northern Cape, they're going to die because they don't know what to do. They have to have learned it. So, according to Eugene Marais, the determining factor in our brain development is the fact that we have to learn from our cultural environment in order to survive. And he sees that as the most critical step which shaped our minds. One of my friends, she did a thesis, and it's called Super-Chimps or Demi-Gods. Her name is Felicity Davis Armitage. And she writes that we cannot get away from primitive wiring, the way our brain has been wired, and the programs are stored there by in our instinct. We cannot get away from it, unfortunately. We are only able to be seduced by something or someone while receiving signals from our midbrain permitting these. So we think that we are free to think thoughts, but it's our brainstem and our midbrain permitting us to think this at a particular moment in time. We've got not control from the top downwards. So topics only enter in our consciousness as long as our midbrain allows it. So the topics only enter our consciousness as long as the midbrain allows it. And if the midbrain doesn't allow it, it won't reach our thought process. Now this poses, I think, a large number of ethical questions. For instance, 100 years ago in Victorian England, the theft of a bread was punishable by death. So that is like really, if you think about it, the animal, the human being, tries to survive. He's hungry. Of course he's going to eat. It's not his free choice to go and get food. His whole existence is focused on getting food. And he's driven by the desire of his body and his midbrain to get food. So if you follow that up, it's quite harsh to kill someone for that. So irrationality, internal mental conflicts, being completely unreasonable, are all evidence of our beings being victims of our very archaic motivational drives. So I think the most fascinating delusion of mankind is probably the idea that we have about ourselves as rational beings, and the thought of ourselves as being radically different from other living beings. I think that is one of the most fascinating delusions of mankind. We are often able to distinguish the difference between some conscious desires and our primitive conscious desires and our primitive desires. So the difference from the brainstem and the midbrain and what we decide. So this is the time of the new year, and we all know in the real world, diets, promises, and New Year's resolutions are being broken continuously. So it's our cortex trying to control what our instinct actually wants to do, and we are unable to do that. And Steven Pinker thinks that the internal discord may be responsible for our whole entire civilization. Now I'm going to talk about the grand illusion. In Genesis, it says the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. But our spirit is not loose of the earth and the body. It is very body bound. We cannot think any thoughts without our body permitting it. And we all know this. If you're exhausted, you can't think. If you're hungry, you can only think about food or only smell food. You go and search. If you're horny, you're looking at the environment very, very different than when you're not horny. Living in constant poverty and hunger, it will transform our entire world in a miserable slump. So this is a very, very important thing to realize. It's not like poor people want to steal or want to get food. They've got no choice. They are forced by that from their being a human. So although we think we are elevated and we can write books and give lectures and do all that stuff, but in fact we are not much better off than the ticks which we talked about yesterday. So our world is depending on just a couple of outside factors. So we are champions of our own interest, and we're also champions at staring at our own navels. But contrary to other things, we are definitely not a very special species at all. So the so-called objective world is, from my perspective, a complete illusion. To maintain that we perceive the world as it is objectively loses sense if we admit the powerful role that our feelings and emotions play in our perceptions. Our view of the outside world is closely interrelated to our mood. Our cortical thoughts and opinions are in essence not any different from our primitive midbrain desires. How is it possible that we see only one picture? Because, I mean, the brainstem tells us something, the midbrain tells us something, and then the cortex tells us another thing. Of course, they are all human constructs. About consciousness, I think it's maybe the same as like with gravity. We all know Newton discovered gravity, and we know if you take an apple and you loosen your grip, it will fall on the floor. We all know what's gravity, but do we really know what it is? We don't know where it comes from. We know it's there, but really, what is it? It's very difficult to describe, and I think with consciousness it may be the same. In nature, everything seems to fit perfectly in itself. So we perceive ourselves as being much more rational than we actually are. And of course, I think the main thing is what I started saying in the first lecture. We remain being animals, and we belong in nature. Our environment is either pleasant, and then we stay, or it is abhorrent, and we move away. Not by rational opinion, what we think, but by survival instinct. If you take an amoebic one-cellular organism, you put it here, and you put a toxin here, and you put food here, where do you think you will go? You will go away from the toxin, you will go to the food. Now, of course, an amoeba, a one-cellular organism, hasn't got a central nerve system, it hasn't got any nerves, but there's already some decision there. He's already got a survival instinct. So just I'm a great hiker. I love hiking in the mountains. So, and when I do that, and when I walk there, mainly Table Mountain, I feel so much at home. And I think it is a reference to the fact that we are animals. We don't belong in classrooms and in houses. We belong outside. They've done lots of experiments in 30 years ago in the United States. Schizophrenic patients or patients in a mental institution. If you put them in the lunchtime, you put them 1 hour in the sun, in their wheelchair or in their bed, the trolley, you move them outside in the sun at lunchtime for 1 hour. Works stronger, better than any medicine. So I mean, it's clear if you look at these things. You know, we are animals and we belong in nature. And I just want to, I'll give you some time to read this poem, which I find extremely beautiful, written by Percy Shelley in 1870. So that's 202 years ago, believe it, 203 years ago. I'll just give you some time to read it. So it's a beautiful, rich, colorful description of what we can perceive when we are in nature. Leonardo da Vinci, he said, all knowledge proceeds from what we feel. We cannot escape biological phenomena. One is the energetic expiration of any impulse. We talked about it. If you walk into a room with a certain smell, your brain cannot continue to send messages that the smell is bad, because you'll be at a loss of any energy, because it has to stop. A human or any natural biological cell cannot continue to discharge energy. So any cell that continues to send a signal will eventually run out of energy to do so. And the way biological systems work is through the mechanism of feedback system. All bodily vegetative functions work through this system. If our blood sugar goes down, we either mobilize glycogen from our stores, or usually the liver, or we find something to eat. If our body cools down, we shiver and we put clothes on. If we experience heat, we undress, and blood circulation through our skin increases. That's why you turn red, because your the blood goes superficial to the outside world and it cools down. From feeling miserable to a euphoria, all these feelings can occur only without clear reasons in our environment. They are, however, vital for our existence. Imagine being in a continuous state of euphoria. They've done experiments in little rhesus monkeys again. So they go and put a probe, they drill a small hole in the skull, they put the electrode to the satisfaction gratification center in the brain. And then they give the monkey a handle, so he can pull on the handle and he can discharge a microcurrent, which gives him full satisfaction. So what do you think will happen to these monkeys? They starve, they die, because they never let go of that handle. That's the same as drug addicts, so they're taking drugs, and they forget about the real life. They're being fooled. So our brains and the feelings, mood swings in this case, have not developed to perceive the outside world objectively. They have developed with the single purpose of securing our continuous existence. Our environment is not there to be objectively perceived, although we often think so. It is only there, it's merely there for us to survive. So I want to talk about Gerald Edelman. He developed the theory of neural Darwinism. There's much neuroscientific research has focused on either micro research with individual cells, or macro research involving methods like MRI, CT scanning. So a lot of research is at cellular level, and a lot of research is on the outside on the very big thing, but actually very little in between. So neither of these techniques have been very helpful in identifying what is really going on in the human brain. So Edelman, he sort of provided a middle solution for these two ways of micro and macro, and he focused on what happened in between these two levels. So the crucial part of his theory resides in the fact that the world does not come to us in already existing objects, but that we create the outside world by making categories of our own individual and personal perception. So every perception becomes an act of creation. Our senses take a sample of the outside world, and our brain creates maps of it. With programs that are already stored in the brain, these maps are either strengthened or depleted. And that happens in a Darwinian fashion. And remember what I was mentioning yesterday about the cats. The cats who have been exposed to horizontal lines they can only see horizontal lines later on. vertical lines, only vertical lines. So what's happening at childbirth is only a few number of neurons, then at the age of 7 there's a massive increase, but then later on something happens that it becomes less again. So the neurons which you don't use are disappearing, and the ones which you use are strengthened in Darwinian fashion. So they call that synaptic pruning. Only those neurons in synapses that contribute positively to the construction of reality for the individual do survive. So primitive cells and living forms without any consciousness of nodes. Reptiles, birds and mammals have a primary consciousness, the ability to create mental scenes to assist them to adapt to complex and changing environment. So this is the higher order of consciousness that allows human to utilize a higher level of what Edelman calls a re-entry signaling. And perhaps other animals such as dolphins, elephants, and our, of course, close relatives such as the primates, they will also have it. Actually, a lot of very high functions, you can, there's been some indication recently that it's not so much the level in the evolution tree where the animal is, but it's also got a lot to do how the brain is structured macroscopically. So in a dolphin has lots of curls on the outside of the brain, the same as human beings have. So that has now been associated with higher mental functions. So how do we create our reality? So we have been branching off the hominoid line for about 5 million years. So chimps were on the one side, we were on the other side. At that time, the organized central nerve tissue was already 1 billion years old. So 5 million years on a period of 1 billion is hardly anything. So our brain developed during this billion years in a way that was independent of consciousness. The brain never developed with the goal of providing a truthful account of our environment. It really developed merely as a tool for survival. So if you look at the brain development, so the cortex is, this is a number of animals that here. And you can see that I think that's a snail, it's a fish. The orange point is very small, and it gradually gets bigger in the frog, and then in the bird, and then eventually in the human being. Of course, we all have a stereoscopic vision, and it's got major advantages. It increases the perception of life, and we compute, because we've got 2 eyes, we compute a 3-dimensional model of the world, which a lot of animals can't do. Because if you don't have overlap then of your visual fields, then you cannot do that. So each and every living being reacts to information in its environment. Ants do, but we are not very different. All the senses we use to perceive the environment developed as biological imperatives and mechanisms to secure our survival. Our brains merely create hypotheses of the outside world in order to sustain our biological survival. So why a big brain and why us? Why not other animals? So there's been a lot of articles, books written about this, and I like this idea of cognitive niche, which was first introduced by Tooby and DeVore. So of course we are consumed by predators, and we develop strategies to avoid them. After which, after a while, the predator outwits us again. So you get sort of like an evolutionary arm race of who is the most clever of the two. So humans are able to use knowledge of how things work in a very efficient way to attain their goals in the face of numerous obstacles. We are smart. So, according to Steven Pinker, the cognitive niche theory incorporates cognitive, affective, and linguistic mechanisms discovered by modern scientific psychology rather than appealing to vague pre-scientific black boxes like symbolic behavior and calling it culture. It invokes the intrinsic advantages of know-how, cooperation, and communication that we recognize uncontroversially in the contemporary world. Science and technology are merely examples of what can be reached through mutual collaboration. It fits pleasantly into the evolutionary biology. Reasoning, cooperation, and communication may all just be a survival advantage, explaining the evolution of these human mental mechanisms. Several recent discoveries have supported these predictions. So the gene, for instance, is a gene for the transcription factor FOXP2, is a monomorphic in normally developed humans, and when it is mutated, it causes severe impairments of speech, grammar, and orofacial motor control, so the expressions of your mouth and face. The human versions of this gene indicate two differences from the version found in the big apes, at least one of them being functional, and the ape homologue shows only a single non-functional difference from the one found in mice. So it's only tiny differences which make all the difference. Several genes expressed in the development of the auditory system differ in humans and chimps, showing signs of selection in the human lineage. Because the general auditory demands on humans and chimps are similar, it is likely that these particular systems were selected for by their utility in the comprehension of speech. We'll talk more about language and speech tomorrow. It is more than likely that many more genes with cognitive, social, and linguistic effects will be identified in the years to come, and the theory of the cognitive niche predicts that most or all of it will turn out to be adaptively evolved. Every man takes the limit of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. So Noam Chomsky, he makes a division between problems and mysteries. Problems we can solve, and he says that also mysteries, these are problems which we cannot solve. So the argument for cognitive closure is that our brains are biologically limited. Daniel Dennett, he likes to quote Orgel's second rule, that whatever you try to do, evolution is always more smart than you are. So they all talks about the strange inversion of reasoning. All design in the biosphere can be and must be the product of a blind, uncomprehending, purposeless process of natural selection. I just want to, I'm coming towards the end of my lecture, talk about the limitations of our perception. So we think we can see color, and we are very proud of that. And we think we can see the whole world. But the range of electromagnetic waves. And we only see this one little band, and then we can see this, only a tiny little part of the range of electromagnetic waves which are in the world around us. We can see a minuscule, a tiny little part of it only. So we've only got 5 senses, maybe some of us 6, but if you call this 6th sense, but we've got only 5 senses. But the range of these modalities is absolutely ridiculously minimal. So the vision is between 390 and 700 nanometer. But look at the range. Look at the range. The range of waves is between 10 to the power of minus 35 to plus 24. That's a range of a number of 60 digits. And we can just see a few hundred of that. It's absolutely tiny, minuscule. It means nothing in nature. We perceive red and green as contrasting, but absolutely they are not contrasting at all. They are next to each other in the range. But we just perceive it as contrast, but it isn't. So all perception information is immediately processed. We are unable to look at anything without our brain immediately attaching value and stuff to it. So you've probably seen this Necker cube. It's a famous cube. It's just a couple of lines, but it is impossible to look at it for us and not think of it as a box. And you can actually see lots of boxes. Some people would see this is the front and this is the back, but you can also sort of like switch over in your brain and you can actually make this the front one and the other one the back. It's an amazing thing. But it just shows you, it's your brain seeing it. It's not, it's just a couple of lines. But we immediately interpreted it as a box. So another example. Do you know this one? It's very, very old. I think 200 years old. So what is it? Is it a duck or a hare? So you can see if it's a duck, then this is the beak of the duck, and it looks like the head. But you can also look from the other side, and you can look at it as a hare. You know? Can you all see it? So this is the ears. If it's a hare, then this is the ears of the hare. And his mouth is here. You can see his eye. So it's of course it's just a couple of lines, but it's our brain telling us what it is. And we can only see things which we know of. We cannot recognize an animal which doesn't exist. So just to show you our limitation, I am absolutely convinced that each and every one of you know this lady. I'm absolutely convinced. All of you know who she is. Huh? What do you think? Who is she? Well, that's reason, but also at some stage, you know, in a family. So our brain, it's very limited. Of course, we all say, oh yeah, of course I could have, but we don't think about Mother Teresa as a young child. It's our knowledge about it is very limited. I was in a museum in Serbia and I took the picture of this. It looks like a Roman emperor. Definitely to me looks like a male face. But this is the same. This is just from the front. So it's sort of like ambiguous. And it was apparently done on purpose. So what do we remember? John Anderson, he's a psychologist, he's done lots of research on what the human memory, how it retrieves information. Number one rule, we never remember anything which is not relevant to us. Number two, we are very biased to what we know. Number three, our memory is very, very colored by emotion, pain or pleasure. I heard this expression only a few years ago, and they say people will never ever remember what you told them, but they will always remember what you made them feel, which is so true. All information is funneled towards the frontal lobe for decision making, so it's going through the brainstem, through the middle brain, to the cortex. Now, Daniel Dennett, I know not all people here are big followers of him, but I think his description of the brain as a society of agents rather than a single mind is very much true, and we can experience that ourselves. The mind is a combination of many various thoughts. The ones who are inborn and very old, like primitive, like being hungry. Then the ones who are from a medium age, things we've learned at school, how to behave, for instance. and then things which are directly around us at this very moment, which can overrule all the other stuff if it is necessary. So just a thing on basic emotions. Of course, we've got emotions, but all of the emotions, from my perspective once again, are related to our survival. Sadness, surprise, happiness, disgust, anger, and fear are all very functional entities for our survival. And of course, we nowadays communicate on WhatsApp, and this is what we use more than anything else, just the basic survival emotions. So sadness, it musters sympathy and support from others. Surprise, it raises our attention and alertness. Happiness increases the will to live and to procreate. And looking for a partner becomes easier. Disgust, we keep away from dangerous contamination. Disgusting, we call it disgusting. Anger, assist in gathering food and procreation in times of heavy competition. If there's limited food, we have to get our own part first. Fear, keeping away from things which are dangerous to us. All these things, survival. So, just a word about soul and self. I've only been talking about the brain and the mind, not very little about the soul. But in books on our consciousness, a lot of people write about the self and a lot of people write about the soul. So about the self, is there only one self? If you look at people with multiple personality disorder, Jekyll and Hyde, then there may be more than one. Also, yourself evolves over time. Yourself, like what you did as a child, is never the same as what you do when you've grown up. And from my pediatric psychological perspective, I love this expression. The child, just listen to it carefully, the child is the father of the man. The child was there first. The child determines what type of man you become. So the child is the father of the grown-up. And of course, there's split brain patients. Driving without talking. I like to hike, and sometimes I do some rock climbing. And on one Saturday afternoon a few years ago, my sister phoned me about something unusual. And I was climbing, and there was perception, so I took the phone call, and she was discussing some issues, sensitive issues. And of course, I was listening attentively to her, and suddenly I realized I was on top. I really don't know. I've got no idea how I got there. I was climbing, but I was like paying all attention to my sister. But my body was climbing and negotiating the difficult rocks. And I still don't know how I did it, because I must have had one hand on my phone. And it just shows you that we all know this experience. You're driving somewhere and you're thinking about something what happened, something tragedy or a threat or a big problem, and suddenly you are in front of your driveway. And you think, geez, how did I get here now? You know? So it's amazing. Our body is able to do a whole lot of stuff on autopilot. While I'm talking to you, I'm also breathing, I hope. Yeah? But it's all done automatically. So there's a lot of different things going on at the same time. Now the soul is the way I've been brought up and see it is seen as the essence of life. And many people in religion, to save souls, it means they are not there permanently; they're there all the time. In Eastern religions, the soul is the actual self, and the body is just a mere manifestation. I think that the big, if you really want to use very big brush strokes, in the West we think we are more materialistic. So the matter was first, and then the spirit evolved. While in many Eastern religions, they describe it as the soul, the spirit was first, and it condensed into material. So this was my fourth lecture. Tomorrow it will be different. I'm just going to discuss a whole number of products. I mean, I call it here consequences and achievements of consciousness. So it's not so much about the development as what consciousness has achieved and can achieve. And before I stop completely, I had a very interesting question yesterday morning on someone asking about the hours spent in front of the screen. How does that affect your brain? And I did some reading about it. So I thought I said 13 hours, but in the Philippines, if you make a list and you rank all the countries of most hours spent to least hours spent, the Philippines are on top of the list. And it's amazing. The average Filipino spends 10 hours per day online. 10 hours. Can you believe that? So, I mean, you're sleeping 8 hours. So your working day is, let's say 16 hours. So basically 2/3 of their existence, they're sitting in front of the screen. So they're not in nature, they're sitting in front of a screen. It's unbelievable. So the Brits are a little bit better. They spend only 5 hours and 46 minutes on the internet per day. Americans, 6 hours, 6.5 hours, Americans. Probably Trump a little bit more. You know. So children in the UK, between the age of 3 and 4, they spend up to 8 hours a day online, with 75% of the 5 to 7 years old spend their time online, spending up to 9 hours a day. And Japan spends the least amount of hours of the country studied, only 3 hours and 45 minutes. So that's still 4 hours. Now, what about the effects? There's a nice article in The Lancet. They reviewed 4,500 children between the age of 8 and 11, and more than 2 hours screen time a day. They proved that it was damaging the development of the brain. It resulted in decreased working memory. It resulted in decreased processing speed, in decreased attention levels, in decreased language skills, and also in decreased executive functions. So it's amazing. I go to these conferences on child abuse and child development, and if you put a small child, if you put children in front of the TV, and you measure what's going on in the brain, there's almost no neurons firing. It's really an amazing thing. So that you put them in front of the TV of a cartoon, and there's auditory and visual input, but if you do an EEG, nothing is going on. If you get a person, like an auntie or a sibling or a parent, to read a story, and you do an EEG, things are firing all around. And it's got to do with the direct emotion of the person reading to them. Doesn't matter even if it's a flat, but there's a hell of a lot of stuff happening in these babies' brains. But if you put them in front of the TV, they look occupied, but nothing happens. Okay.